All right, so this is the second half of this section, and we're talking about political prisoners. And I wanted to talk about kind of some subtypes, some different ways of dividing up who's a political prisoner and who's not, and types of political prisoners, and some of the things they face as political prisoners. Um, but relatively recently, in kind of the grand scheme of things, we've there's kind of been a new term coined to describe a certain subset of political prisoners, which are called prisoners of conscience. Okay, prisoners of conscience are the ones who are there for either innate characteristics, like being Jewish, being gay, being Romani, or their political activities, not necessarily, not their kind of criminal activities or violent activities, but non-violent political activities, right? So these are people who are being put in prison for who they are, or essentially what they say. Okay, and these prisoners of conscience are very disturbingly common throughout the world. Okay, I've highlighted some of the more famous examples, but there are lots and lots and lots more of these examples that you can look at, either existing today or throughout history. So the first one is the situation in Tibet, which I touched briefly on earlier in this section. But essentially, back in the 50s, I want to say, somewhere back, many decades ago, China annexed the country of Tibet, and the Tibetans are fairly united in their saying, like, we don't want to be part of China, we want to be outside of China. But China is essentially saying, tough luck, keep quiet about it. And so any Tibetan people who demonstrate against China's occupation and annexation of Tibet will get arrested and thrown in prison just because they've expressed opposition to the Chinese government ruling Tibet. And even today, even if you're a Western visitor to China, if you have, a free Tibet bumper sticker, or a patch on your backpack or whatever, you can get arrested in the country of China just for a free Tibet sticker, patch, or whatever. Jews, obviously, World War II, Germany is the biggest example. But if you look in Jewish history, there have been lots of examples of them being kind of prisoners or slaves just because they were Jewish. Going all the way back to, the Old Testament of the Bible has stories about them being slaves in Egypt. But there have been lots of countries and lots of times when it was a crime just to be Jewish. Homosexuals, very similar history, right? There have been a lot of cultures throughout history that have been completely accepting of homosexuality, but then a lot of cultures, especially just in the last few hundred years, who have criminalized it. And of course, Nazi Germany, in addition to putting the Jews in concentration camps, they put homosexuals in the concentration camps too. Here in the United States, it was illegal to be a homosexual in many states, right up until 2003. When these two gentlemen sued and won a Supreme Court case called Lawrence v. Texas, which finally, the Supreme Court, as recently as 2003, said, look, you can't criminalize being gay. That's not okay. And then, of course, it was another, 13 years before the Supreme Court said gay people are allowed to get married, right? So that is the kind of criminalization of these innate characteristics. And then there's the conscientious objectors, which again kind of became famous during the Vietnam era in the United States, but it's a continuing and continuous problem all over the world throughout history. Many governments throughout history and continuing to this day have some kind of conscription, i.e., every able-bodied man from this age to this age has to fight as a soldier in this war that we're going to fight. And in the Vietnam era in the United States, there was kind of very famous people who said, no, I don't want to fight in a war. Like, I'm not going to go kill somebody in a war I don't like just because my government tells me I have to. So there was, a famous case of men burning their draft cards, right? Saying, no, I'm not going to fight in this war. And back then and to this day, there are people who get thrown in prison for not wanting to fight in a war and kill other people. And they're kind of commonly referred to as conscientious objectors. And those are prisoners of conscience. Now, this is a really tough one. This is one of those subjects that a lot of people have very, very strong feelings about. When I teach this in a classroom setting, there's always really good talk and debate, but also people get very emotional and get very angry when they hear something that kind of disagrees with their fundamental worldview. But there's a kind of a famous saying that says, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, right? Which essentially, the point is, everybody has in their history, their culture's history, there's always that group that fought against an oppressive government with violence and won, and they're seen as heroes. But these other people who are fighting against their government using the same techniques, the same motivations, the same tactics, they're terrorists. And what's the difference, right? Why are some groups hailed as heroes and some groups seen as these evil terrorists for doing what amounts to very similar things? And it essentially comes down to the perceived or actual morality of what they're fighting for, I think. So the entire concept of terrorism is a social construct, right? It's society trying to put label on groups who the powerful think are doing a bad thing, and but the groups themselves believe are doing the righteous thing. And when you agree with the people who are doing the thing, they're called freedom fighters. But when you and your personal morality agrees with the government or the society, then they're terrorists. And it's not about the people doing the thing, it's about the societal reaction and the government reaction and the views on the morality of the group that's doing the violence that determines whether they're referred to as terrorists or whether they're referred to as freedom fighters. So there are groups that looking back in history, there are groups that basically the vast majority of people in the Western world see as not terrorists. They were called terrorists at the time. They used the same techniques and tactics as terrorists, but we don't see them as terrorists. We don't want to call them terrorists. So the American Revolution, perfect example, right? A lot of what the colonists fighting against the British did was, by the strict definition of the word, terrorism, and they were called terrorists back then. But because we agree with their motivations and the outcome, we say, oh, they're not terrorists, they're heroes. John Brown, he was one of the first to fight with violence against slavery prior to the Civil War. Back in the 1850s, he essentially fought with violence against the concept of slavery. And most people today see him not as a terrorist, but as a freedom fighter. The Edelweiss Pirates, they were a group of European teenagers who fought against the Nazis. They were resistance fighters. And then the African National Congress was a group of Africans in South Africa who fought with violence against the oppressive South African apartheid state. And those groups, all of those groups, looking back with the kind of the clarity of history, we say they're not terrorists, they're heroes, because we morally agree with them, because society has deemed their goals good, right? On the other end of the spectrum, there are groups that the vast majority of us think are absolutely terrorists, right? Like ISIS, like Al Qaeda. We don't agree with what they did, with their motivations, with their tactics, with their ultimate goals. So they're definitely terrorists. Our society has kind of gotten together and said, look, we don't like what they did, we don't like what they're doing. Those guys are terrorists. And then there's the kind of groups in the middle where you get kind of some people call them terrorists, some people call them freedom fighters, and it's still kind of in the middle whether we as a society are going to say, okay, we agree with what they did, or no, we really don't agree with what they did. The Irish Republican Army in Ireland and the UK, they were called terrorists by the UK for a long time. But in Ireland and in a lot of places that feels for the Irish, they're freedom fighters. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, they are fighting in, not so much anymore, but they were fighting in Israel and Palestine, and their goal was to have a home state for these Palestinian people. And they were very violent in their history, and now they're much more of a kind of political organization. And it's unclear whether they're going to go down in history, or at least Western history, as freedom fighters or as terrorists. So it's a very tough determination sometimes, and individuals may feel like, oh, I absolutely know that the IRA are terrorists, or the PLO, they're definitely terrorists. But it's not so much about what individuals believe as about what kind of the collective society has decided. Does that make sense? All right, so house arrest and exile. House arrest and exile are both kind of focused on the denial of home, right? We all have this idea in our head of what is home, what is that safe place for you, where it's your space, you control it, you can be who you want to be and do what you want to do, and that's your home, okay? With exile, the denial of home is obvious, right? You get kicked out of your home kingdom or country or whatever. Napoleon, after he lost, he was actually exiled twice. The first time he got out, came back to France. But the first time he was exiled from France, he went to Elba, this island where they essentially, he had kind of free run of the island, but he couldn't go back to France. He eventually did end up going back to France, but then got kicked out again and was sent on exile to some other place, and was there until he died. But that exile was a denial of home, which is fairly common for political prisoners. It's not that we're restricting your freedom. It's not that we're putting you in a cell. It's not that we're saying you can't do almost whatever you want to do. It's just you can't come back here, right? Which some people might say is worse than prison. Some people might say it's not as bad, but it is still one common way that countries will deal with these political prisoners, just exile. And then there's house arrest, which is also a denial of home. And you might think to yourself, wait a minute, how is forcing you to be in your home a denial of home? That doesn't make any sense. And the point is, it's a denial of home because it turns your home, your place of safety, into a prison. You're taking away the entire concept of the home. You're taking the physical structure of the house, stripping it of its homeness, and creating a prison out of it. Okay? In Myanmar, what used to be called Burma, in South Asia in 1990, there was a military government, and they had free elections in 1990. And this woman, her political party won a huge majority of the votes and a huge majority of the seats in the government. But the military didn't like her. So instead of giving up power, the military put her in house arrest and essentially kept power for most of the next 20 years. And she spent most of the next 20 years on house arrest as the legitimate, democratically elected head of government for this country. But she couldn't do anything about it because she was locked in her home for essentially the next 20 years. This is also one of those kind of controversial things. Throughout a lot of American history, the US government has sent police to train other countries how to keep social order. And that's a really great goal, right? We should have competent, professional, law-abiding police all over the world. And if that was both the intention and the outcome of these programs, I wouldn't be talking about them right now. That would be a very good thing to do. We want police to be professional. We want them to be capable. We want them to keep that social order. But unfortunately, in many cases, this training turned into how to more efficiently oppress your citizenry, especially in Central and South America. Okay, there were numerous countries that the United States sent police to train these Central and South American police forces, and they ended up using that training to further oppress and violate the human rights of the populations of those countries, right? The reason we did it is because, this was during the Cold War. So America is the great capitalist nation, Soviet Union is this great communist nation, and we wanted allies on our side, right? So we wanted, especially in Central and South America, we wanted those countries to like us more than they liked the Soviet Union. So we were giving them aid of all different kinds, and this was one of the ways we gave them aid. The problem is they used it for a lot of really terrible things, right? So instead of using these, the equipment, the techniques, all these things to maintain social order, they used them to clean up their countries, which usually meant imprisoning lots of people who spoke out against the government, right? Whether they were communists, whether they were just people who wanted free speech, college students protesting about different stuff. These policing techniques were used to kind of rule with an iron fist in a lot of these cases and violate huge numbers of people's civil and human rights. But the worst, the absolute kind of the pinnacle of bad political prisoner policing, denial of human rights, kind of the worst it gets in this little subset of political prisoners is what's called disappearances. Okay, this again is a relatively new term for a practice that is much older. Disappearances are essentially where a government uses some kind of secret police force. It's almost never the actual police or the actual military, but former military, former police officers who come in and form this secret police. And they come usually in the middle of the night and kidnap people and take them off. And nobody knows where, and nobody sees them again, usually. Sometimes, many, many years or many decades later, they'll come home with tales of, I was in such and such prison or such and such concentration camp or work camp or whatever. But most of the time, they just are never heard from again. And there's no public trial. There's no acknowledgement by the government that, yes, this person is a prisoner, or this person was convicted of this, or this person was executed. There's no acknowledgement by the government whatsoever that that person even existed, right? Usually they just, maybe many years later, their body is found in a shallow, unmarked grave somewhere. And this has two kind of purposes behind it. The first is punishment, right? So again, these are usually political prisoners. So it's somebody who disagrees with the government, maybe a famous political rival, or somebody who's been known to organize protests about free speech or a free press or whatever. Many times it's members of the press themselves, reporters who write articles that are critical of the government. These disappearances, kind of the obvious thing, the obvious reason for them is to punish those people, right? Either send them to prison, or more commonly, just kill them and dump the body. But kind of the more important thing, the slightly more subtle but more important reason for this is fear. The government wants you to be afraid. The government, by using this tactic of disappearing people, not only wants to punish the people that they're actually kidnapping and killing, they also want to create fear in people who agreed with them, right? So if I'm just, Joe Nobody in whatever country, and I see that people who advocate for free speech are disappearing, then I'm going to be afraid to advocate for free speech, right? And it's a way for the government to control through fear, right? To keep an oppressed population oppressed by using fear. And instead of doing it through the normal court system, instead of doing it publicly, they do these disappearances essentially in cases where they know it's non-justifiable, right? They know that people will get upset if they get caught doing these things. They know that they couldn't win a fair trial, and they don't even want the publicity of an unfair trial. They know their position is non-justifiable. They know they're not supposed to be doing this, but they need or want to do it anyway to keep that population afraid. Okay? These were very, very famously used all over Central and South America, especially Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Colombia. Lots of these countries have, in the kind of 70s, 80s time frame, used these disappearances. And these, and the US kind of looked the other way because they were capitalist dictatorships. We vastly preferred capitalist dictatorships that did horrible things to countries that sided with the Soviet Union. So we were totally willing to overlook these horrible human rights atrocities as long as they kind of ostensibly stayed our allies in this Cold War. Soviet Union was also really famous for doing this. In fact, this picture here is a Swedish kind of aid worker, I guess you could call him, who went into Soviet territory trying to help people and was never heard again. And I believe to this day, the Soviet Union claims that, he arrived at such and such business, their Soviet minister of whatever talked to him, and he left. And they have no idea what happened to him. Not many people believe that story. So the common belief is that he was disappeared by the Soviet Union, and even the Swedish government could never get information about what happened to the Swedish citizen in the Soviet Union. And of course, they were even more famous for doing it to their own people, right? Many times they would just, these people in the Soviet Union would disappear, and most of the time they were killed. Sometimes they were sent off to work camps in Siberia or where elsewhere within this giant country. North Korea doing it today. North Korea is one of those states around the world that still uses disappearances to this day. Obviously, we don't have a lot of information directly from North Korea, but we get a lot of information from people who defect. They sneak out of North Korea either to South Korea or to China, end up, coming to some other country, and we essentially talk to them about what life is like in North Korea. And one of the kind of recurring themes is that the North Korean government uses these disappearances to keep order. If somebody starts speaking up against the North Korean state, they disappear and nobody ever hears from them again. So this method, this technique, is one of the most disturbing of all of the human rights violations that states are known to use. It's horrible, it's disturbing, and yeah. Anyway, I'm going to end it there. I think that's the end of the slides. Yep, that's the end. I will see you for the next section.